This fraud book is a great resource for older adults looking to prevent fraud, featuring tips that will help them identify a scam and resources for those older adults who have been scammed. Today's hearing will not only discuss fraud prevention and the tips highlighted in the fraud book, but also how the federal government and law enforcement agencies respond to reports of fraud. The scams that are perpetrated against older adults today seem similar to scams that have been around for a number of years. We've all heard of these, unfortunately, and so many families have been the victims of them. Grandparent scams, where a scammer pretends to be a grandchild calling in need of financial help. Investment scams, government imposter scams, lottery scams, tech support scams are just a few of the scams highlighted in our fraud book. However, over the past few years, scammers have gotten increasingly sophisticated in how they contact and prey on their targets. With the advent of artificial intelligence that we all know as AI, scammers can now make their messages both online and over the phone more convincing. Email or computer pop-up scams used to be more easily identifiable, but now are much harder to detect. In some cases, scammers go as far as cloning the voice, and we had testimony in this hearing, or this committee to that effect, cloning the voice of a loved one to convince the target of their veracity. It has become nearly impossible to tell whether the person on the other end of the line is legitimate or a scammer. That may explain why recent FBI data shows that fraud losses among older adults have gone up in recent years, reaching $3.4 billion in 2023. Leaders in scam prevention and education, like AARP, are racing to keep up with these trends and continue to educate older adults. Meanwhile, law enforcement is facing an uphill battle when it comes to responding to reports, investigating and identifying the perpetrators, and so many other challenges. I'm thankful that we have Scott Perillo, who's here today, who can share more about the work he is doing to fight fraud as Deputy District Attorney in San Diego. But we've got a lot more to do. We need to continue to alert older adults about the scams they may be targeted with, and we need to work together across all levels of government to identify and root out these bad actors. I'll just change that and say criminals. That's what they are. Furthermore, we need to help those who have been victimized by scammers. Earlier this year, I released a report called Scammed Then Taxed, detailing how the 2017 tax bill repealed a long-standing tax tool that helps scam victims avoid more losses. Older adults disproportionately use what was known as the casualty and theft, the casualty and theft loss deduction. And my report highlighted the crushing financial blow that this law dealt to scam victims, leaving them paying heavy taxes on stolen retirement savings. On top of financial losses, this experience can be emotionally devastating and isolating. I'm grateful to have Susan Whitaker from Lehigh County in Pennsylvania here with us today. Susan will be sharing her and her husband's experience with tech support scams. Susan's testimony is critical for us to hear today. It's important for older adults across the nation to know that they are not alone if they lost money to a scammer. So I'm pleased that the Aging Committee can shed light on these stories, and I'll now turn to Ranking Member Braun for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Casey. And if you listen closely, it's worth repeating, $3.4 billion. That's what scammers got out of American seniors in 23. They're coming from all kinds of places, Mexico, China, a lot of African countries. One of these criminals they received the money, it is basically gone, almost impossible to get it back. They impersonate others, fabricate stories, make false promises, so many different ways, and the only way is to prevent it once it just starts to occur. That's why we need to prioritize education and outreach so older adults recognize these red flags immediately. Our community banks and credit unions are often on the first line of defense, intervening where they can see from their own past experience that something looks askew. In my home state of Indiana, one community bank already has avoided $1.2 million in one community bank. That's a lot. Local law enforcement also play a crucial role in scam prevention by investigating these cases, alerting the public of something that's out there. Scammers are always looking for that next loophole, including federal programs, because this place has got so much money, so many programs, and is probably the defenseless of anything out there. We've talked about the fraud in Medicare alone, which is astounding, the amount of money. $60 billion due to fraud, errors, and abuse, most of it fraud. Every dollar lost to fraud is a dollar that can't be spent on what the program's intended to do. In these scams, Medicare numbers are used to purchase medical equipment that a senior doesn't need. This leads to additional co-payments and out-of-pocket costs and can use up an enrollee's benefits faster. Medicare fraud directly hurts taxpayers and individual seniors, and we are still trying to figure out exactly how pervasive it is because there's so much spent in that category. In March, I led a letter to the GAO requesting a full audit of Medicare fraud. GAO began that audit in July. This will be the most comprehensive audit in the history of Medicare, long overdue. The results will uncover just how much fraudsters are stealing from the American taxpayer in one of our programs that's so important, along with Social Security, Medicaid, and ironically, the three that drive some of our structural deficits anyway. We can't afford one penny of fraud. We know that CMS can do more to stop fraud, and we're going to keep pushing to see that they do it. I introduced the Medicare Transaction Fraud Prevention Act with Senator Cassidy, which empowers CMS to conduct a fraud detection pilot utilizing AI to detect scams so that CMS can quickly alert the Medicare beneficiary, similar to what credit card companies do. They're pretty good at it because that's the place where most fraud occurs in our country. The 2024 fraud book highlights many of the scams targeting older Americans and provides information on how to recognize the red flags. Anybody out there listening, get a hold of your representative, your senator, and get a hold of this because it is the best, probably small, short, concise book that can give you a heads up. Look forward to hearing from our witnesses so we can learn more about it, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Braun. Now we'll begin witness introductions, and after those, we'll go to the testimony. But we're pleased to introduce our witnesses. We're grateful they're here, having traveled here to provide testimony. Our first witness is Kathy Stokes. Ms. Stokes is the Director of Fraud Prevention Programs with the Fraud Watch Network at AARP. She leads AARP's social mission work to educate older adults on the risks that fraud presents to their financial security. So, Ms. Stokes, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. Our second witness is Mr. Scott Perillo. He's the Deputy District Attorney and Head of Elder Abuse Prosecutions in the San Diego District Attorney's Office in San Diego, California. Mr. Perillo, thank you for sharing your expertise in traveling here today. Our third witness is a Pennsylvanian, Susan Whitaker. Ms. Whitaker is the Administrative Assistant at Lehigh County's Office of Aging and Adult Services in Allentown, Pennsylvania. That's on the eastern side of our state, not far from the New Jersey-Pennsylvania border. Ms. Whitaker's late husband, Bill, was the victim of a scam in 2022. We're grateful, Susan, for you being here today and for sharing your story and Bill's stories with us. And I'll now turn to Ranking Member Braun to introduce our fourth witness.
It's my pleasure to introduce Nancy Gilmer-Moore. She is the Program Director for Indiana's Senior Medicare Patrol. Ms. Moore's work has been nationally recognized. She received the 2023 Barbara McGinty Award for her distinguished service as a champion for all in the fight against healthcare fraud. Ms. Moore is a graduate of Indiana University and is dedicated to serving Hoosiers. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ranking Member Braun. Now we'll turn to Ms. Stokes for her opening statement.
Good morning. My name is Kathy Stokes, and I'm the Director of Fraud Prevention Programs for AARP. Thank you for inviting me to testify on behalf of AARP at this important hearing, and I'd also like to thank the AARP volunteers who are here with me. This morning, I'll shed light on the true impact of fraud, explain that anyone can be a victim and that it isn't their fault, and I'll speak to the urgent need for a whole-of-society response to the fraud crisis. Through the Fraud Watch Network, AARP educates older adults on the risk that fraud poses to their financial security, meeting them where they are. Hundreds of volunteers work with our state offices and communities across the country to equip older Americans to avoid fraud. We share information online through newsletters and a podcast, and we cover fraud in most editions of our publications that tens of millions of Americans receive. Our victim support program includes a helpline that receives 500 calls a day. We also host support groups to address fraud's emotional impact. It's for people like Dave, who experienced a years-long romance scam through which criminals stole his home and his business. He lost his friends and family and seriously contemplated suicide. The recent growth in fraud has been meteoric. The FTC revealed that estimates of underreporting in 2023, suggesting that rather than $9 billion reported stolen through fraud in 1 year, it is more likely closer to $137 billion. And criminals don't discriminate. They target every demographic. FTC data suggests that younger adults report theft by fraud more often than older adults, but when the older adults are victimized, the financial impact can be catastrophic. These victims are financially ruined. They experience emotional and health impacts. Often, their families are torn apart, and many once financially secure, hardworking Americans are left to rely on government safety nets. In my written testimony, I describe the sophistication and scale of today's fraud crime rings, but sophistication and scale alone aren't the reasons they succeed. Rather, it's because criminals know how to exploit the human brain. AARP's own research unveiled that criminals know that to trigger a heightened emotional state is to bypass logical thinking. Criminals call it getting targets under the ether, and academics have shed light on the science behind it. Linda, a college professor, shared her story with AARP about the day her life was turned upside down when a tech support scam that started with a fear-inducing computer pop-up message led to a 4.5-month nightmare. It forced her to retire, and it saw her buying gold bars and putting them into a stranger's car. She thinks the whole experience could have killed her. Becoming a victim is not the victim's fault. It's not because of their age or because of cognitive decline. They become a victim because criminals exploit how our brains function. And while there's no single solution to the fraud crisis, there are things we could all be doing that could help turn the tide. For individuals, it's taking steps like freezing our credit and using password managers and multi-factor authentication. For educators, focusing on the red flags is important, but so is training how most scams come at us and what to do when they do. For industry, financial institutions must continue to innovate on fraud mitigation, and tech companies must build safety and security into their product design and manufacturing. And industry and law enforcement must work together. AARP is leading a public-private effort to enhance coordination through the formation of a national Elder Fraud Coordination Center, which should launch this year. Its origins linked to the FBI San Diego County Elder Justice Task Force, which has proven that gathering data on like cases creates actionable investigations and prosecutions. I'm honored to be at this table with San Diego's Deputy DA, Scott Perello, who directly supports the work of the Elder Justice Task Force. Policymakers can address fraud by supporting resources for state and local law enforcement and full-time investigators for DOJ Elder Justice Strike Forces, reinstating the casualty loss deduction to address the taxation of stolen assets, legislation to limit the damage of crypto ATMs, and efforts like the National Elder Fraud Coordination Center. AARP looks forward to collaborating with you on solutions to address fraud, and thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Ms. Stokes, thanks very much, and we'll turn next to Mr. Perello.
Good morning, Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, other members of the Senate Special Committee on Aging. Thank you for having me here. My name is Scott Perello, and I am a career elder abuse prosecutor for the San Diego District Attorney's Office. I had an epiphany in 2018 when I realized I was seeing 0 scam cases. After some digging, I was shocked to learn that there were hundreds of reports that existed, but once local police departments determine that the scammers are far away overseas, the cases are discarded. I assumed then that someone was in charge of working these cases. I was wrong. Right at this moment, thousands of seniors are being scammed by foreign nationals on the verge of having their lives destroyed. The most prevalent scam impacting seniors today starts with a pop-up message from Microsoft that asks the victim to call a spoofed telephone number. The scammers, mostly operating from Indian call centers, convince those seniors to download remote access software, authorizing the scammers to see inside their computers, and ultimately convincing them that their bank accounts have also been compromised. Victims are instructed that in order to save their money, they must withdraw tens of thousands of dollars in cash from their bank or purchase gold bars. They demand that cash be converted to cryptocurrency and sent through Bitcoin ATM machines or packaged up in boxes. They are instructed to either ship the boxes across the country or they are told a courier will be coming to their house. This narrative is exactly what occurred in San Diego just last week. A 94-year-old Air Force veteran lost $143,000 in 5 separate cash pickups over a 2-week period. Hundreds of thousands of victims fight through humiliation and shame each year and summon the courage to report that this has happened to them. But these victims are met with the most regrettable answer: I'm sorry, there's nothing that we can do for you. We should all be ashamed of ourselves. I'm here today on behalf of the millions of elder victims and their families, begging the government, law enforcement, the banking and technology industries to help them. Existing programs are failing to impact the tsunami of fraud that we are seeing every day, and a national strategy is needed. We're failing the very people who need us the most: older adults, many whom can't afford to lose anything, let alone everything. Since 2019, on the backs of a few patriotic former Marines working in our DA's office and the San Diego FBI office, we have proven that something could be done to fight this siege. Instead of surrender, under the leadership of San Diego County's elected DA, Summer Steffen, we worked with the San Diego FBI in 2021 to launch a first-of-its-kind Elder Justice Task Force, or EJTF, to combat elder fraud. We have since learned that scammers abroad depend on organized networks of money launderers within the United States, and there are thousands of criminals within these networks to bring to justice. The EJTF consists of the DA's office, FBI, Adult Protective Services, U.S. Attorney's Office, local law enforcement, and our local fusion center, all working together to turn individual local fraud investigations into large-scale federal cases, and also using federal seizure warrants to recover millions in fraudulent funds for our victims whether a criminal investigation is opened or not. This is the only initiative in the nation responding to elder fraud cases in real time by tracking each fraud report collected by local police, the FBI's IC3 database, and APS. This active review of reports and constant contact with victims enables us to better understand how these transnational criminal networks operate. We are disrupting these networks. We are routinely filing state prosecutions on couriers, which have resulted in federal indictments, including July's indictment by the U.S. Attorney's Office of a money laundering ring responsible for receiving stolen funds from over 2,000 older victims, totaling $27 million in losses. The numbers are doubling in San Diego from 2002 to 2023, with $98 million in losses. Investing in education and task forces are critical to fighting these scams. However, we can't educate our way out of this problem, nor can we prosecute our way out. We need a whole-of-nation strategy. The cause of fighting elder fraud does not yet have a face. It is too siloed and unorganized. The U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging should take the lead to ensure that not one more victim falls prey to these scams. We can actually stop this problem. We can all do more for these victims, especially for the grandparents who are going to wake up tomorrow and turn on their computer and have a pop-up ad. What will our answer be tomorrow when those victims call us for help? Thank you.
Mr. Perillo, thank you for your testimony. We'll turn next to Susan Whitaker.
Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, and members of the Special Committee on Aging. Thank you for inviting me here today to hear my story. I'm Susan Whitaker, an administrative assistant for the executive director of the Lehigh County Aging and Adult Services in Allentown. I've been in my current position for 4 years. My previous position was 45 years at the Morning Call, a local newspaper. I'm presenting testimony today because my late husband, Bill, was a victim of a scam. I will also share the steps I took once I knew the scam had happened and the unavailability of the bank we entrusted with our personal account and business account. It was Tuesday night when I got home, and Bill was more quiet than normal. He did not talk for the next few days. Bill suffered from dementia and Alzheimer's, diabetes, congestive heart failure, pulmonary embolisms, and neuropathy. At the time of the scam, he was 75. Although Bill had sold his business, Bill Whitaker & Son Construction, LLC, to his son, Bill stayed on as the office manager. He took care of all office responsibilities. As the week went on, Bill seemed to be quieter and he seemed to be worried. On Friday night, he started to tell me what had happened. He told me he received an email from QuickBooks, which was used to manage bookkeeping for the business. The email said that the business account had been charged $499 for an upgrade. He said he didn't order the upgrade. He contacted what he thought was QuickBooks at that point. The person told Bill that in order for him to refund Bill's money, Bill needed to first pay him $500, and then QuickBooks, who was really the scammer, would send it right back to him via another payment platform. He was told not to share this with anyone because if he did, he would not get his money back. Bill was instructed to install an application on the computer so he could transfer the funds directly to the scammer's checking account. Bill also scanned and sent him a copy of his Social Security card and driver's license. Once everything had been set up, the scammer told Bill he would set up a Venmo account. He walked him through the process. Finally, he showed Bill how to transfer the $500 via Venmo. Because the scammer had access to the computer as Bill was in the middle of typing the number 500, the scammer took control through the software and added an extra zero. 500 became 5,000. He started yelling at Bill for making such an error, when in reality, Bill had not made a mistake. He said that now Bill needed to send him the $5,000 in order for him to send back $5,000. That Friday night, Bill shared with me, in addition to the $499 initial fraudulent upgrade fee that needed to be refunded to the business account. This individual now owed us money from our personal account due to the numerous Venmo transfers. Bill said that this individual would be calling him back tonight at 6 p.m. This time I answered the phone. The scammer was totally surprised to hear from someone other than Bill. I questioned the process he had put Bill through. I knew it was a scam, but I asked him to please check with the boss. He said he would call me back. At that point, I wasn't even sure how much money had been taken from our accounts. While waiting for the callback, I shut down the Mac and booted it back up. I created a new login account and deleted the old information. I found the software that was installed and uninstalled it. I also contacted our bank, Truist, through their customer service department. Since it was after 6 p.m., customer service was closed until Monday morning at 8. Then I called their fraud number. They too were closed until Monday morning. Bill called the bank manager at the local branch and asked for help. The branch manager said he would do what he could, but he wasn't sure he would be able to get any of our money back. Monday morning, Bill called local law enforcement. He spoke with him, and they said they would be in touch with the bank and would work with them. The person Bill spoke with was very kind and patient. During that time, I put a stop on all credit reporting, a hold on all accounts, and called the Truist headquarters in North Carolina. I never did get to speak to anyone. In the end, the scammer took a total of $28,000 from us. However, the bank, along with the law enforcement, recovered $8,000 of the money taken from our accounts. Because I acted so quickly, they were able to stop the funds before they were dispersed. Despite this, we still lost $20,000. The scam was devastating and had a devastating effect on Bill, both financially and emotionally. Because we lost $20,000 and Bill had a lot of chronic health issues, he began to ration his medications. We just couldn't afford them anymore. Bill also felt responsible and felt that he owed it to his son to repay the money. He kept saying he was sorry and that he was stupid. He asked how could he make such a stupid mistake. I assured him that he was only trying to save $499 from the business and that he didn't do anything wrong. For several days, he was very quiet. After the scam, Bill would not answer the phone unless he knew the number, and he would not open his email unless I reviewed it. Bill started to doubt himself and everything he did. His son no longer allowed him to do any work for the office, and so Bill lost his job. He also lost his sense of self-worth. It was really sad to see this very intelligent and past business owner become so afraid to read emails and use a phone. It was a huge setback for him, and I think contributed to his worsening health conditions. Thank you.
Susan, thanks for your testimony, and I know it has to be personally difficult to relive that. We're just grateful you're willing to do it, to testify that in a manner that will help others, so we're grateful for that.
Thank you.
And finally, Ms. Moore?
I would like to thank Ranking Member Braun, Chairman Casey, the other witnesses, and all in attendance for giving me this opportunity to speak about Medicare fraud and scams that target older adults and people with disabilities. As the Indiana Senior Medicare Patrol, or SMP, program director since 2013, I have learned that one of the biggest crimes affecting older Americans and people with disabilities is Medicare fraud, waste, and abuse. In addition to Medicare's own provider-focused fraud prevention units within the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, the U.S. Administration for Community Living, ACL, funds and supports the beneficiary-focused Senior Medicare Patrol program. With programs in every state, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, SMP's purpose is to educate beneficiaries, caregivers, and professionals on how to prevent, detect, and report Medicare fraud. CMS offers no official estimates of total yearly Medicare fraud, but healthcare experts estimate improper Medicare payments are approximately $60 billion per year. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, OIG, most recent annual report indicated that SMP projects reported more than $111 million in expected Medicare recoveries in 2023. Our Indiana SMP uses volunteers and in-kind members in partnership with most area agencies on aging, 4 senior centers, and a Center for Independent Living to help us educate people about fraud, errors, and abuse in Medicare. Our partners give public presentations, exhibit at health and senior fairs, and provide individual counseling across Indiana. We also regularly publish statewide social media updates, generate earned television and print media through relationships we cultivate with local investigative reporters, and periodically conduct SMP marketing campaigns. We also collaborate with organizations through a coalition we founded with the Indiana Secretary of State's office called the Indiana Council Against Senior Exploitation, or INCASE. Members include the Indiana Secretary of State's office, the Indiana Attorney General's office, State Health Insurance Assistance Program, or SHIP, the Social Security Administration, the Internal Revenue Service, the Indiana State Police, financial institutions, and many others to conduct joint presentations about Medicare fraud and other financial scams that target older adults. SMP programs across the country can provide early detection and warning of emerging frauds and scams. Here are some examples of suspected fraud that the Indiana SMP reported to the OIG during the past year. In the intermittent urinary catheter fraud scheme, most of the beneficiaries noticed billing for urinary catheters on their Medicare statements that they and their doctor neither ordered, needed, nor received. Many were billed for multiple months, with Medicare paying about $1,500 per month for each separate billing. I personally noticed billings for urinary catheters on my own Medicare statement for May and June and promptly reported the suspicious claim to CMS and requested a new Medicare number since mine was compromised. Durable medical equipment, or DME fraud, is a perennial scam which includes all types of orthotic braces. Beneficiaries continue to contact Indiana SMP, reporting unsolicited calls identifying themselves as representing Medicare with an offer for free orthotic braces. The scam often begins with an initial contact from a call center, which makes a referral to an unscrupulous doctor or telemedicine company, and a final referral to a DME provider. The braces delivered are often inferior, and the beneficiary's personal doctor is not typically notified nor consulted. The Indiana SMP recommends that all Medicare enrollees and their caregivers review their Medicare summary notices or MSNs for Medicare fee-for-service or explanation of benefits, EOBs, for Medicare Advantage plans. Beneficiaries should be on the lookout for duplicate billing, services or products not rendered or received, and services not ordered by their physician. We also remind beneficiaries and caregivers that they should never give their Medicare number or financial information over the phone to unknown caller, and that Medicare does not make unsolicited phone calls. Ensuring the financial integrity of Medicare is essential to the millions of Americans who currently depend on it to access comprehensive health care services, as well as thousands of people who become newly eligible for Medicare every day. As U.S. citizens, we all need to become better, more conscientious health care consumers and help identify any potential improper payments. To that end, we have supported Senator Braun's and this committee's work to reduce or eliminate Medicare fraud. We assisted Senator Braun's office with the development of his Medicare Transaction Fraud Prevention Act, which would enhance the Medicare fraud prevention system to alert the beneficiary being scammed. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to share my experiences with you today.
Ms. Moore, thanks very much for your testimony. We're going to move to questions now. I'll start, and then I'll turn to Ranking Member Braun. I wanted to start with Susan Whitaker. Susan, I wanted to, again, thank you for providing not just testimony, but sharing your personal experience, that you lived through and your husband lived through, and the loss you suffered, both the financial loss as well as the loss of your husband. You had shared, and I think one of the words that come, the phrases that come to mind are red flags. You had shared with us that you could identify some of those red flags, I guess mostly based upon your work with the Lehigh County Office of Aging and Adult Services, which is for that county the area agency on aging. So your work helped you recognize some of these red flags when Bill shared what had happened during the scam. We know that education, providing information from for example, our fraud book, is critically important. And we wanted to make sure that we not only had a fraud book, but we have two versions of it. The one on my right is in English, the one on my left is in Spanish. And we'll make reference to the fraud book again, but we want folks to know that you can receive this information. You can go to our website at aging.senate.gov/scam. And I'll say that again for people that are listening. You go to the Aging Committee's website at aging.senate.gov/scam. And we want to make sure that people can avail themselves of this information. This isn't limited to one category of Americans or one age group. This can happen to anyone. And it's always easier, of course, after the fact to review what happened in a case and say, oh, I would have noticed that. Maybe not, no matter what your age, maybe not. And so we've all got to be made aware of these scams. But Susan, I wanted to ask you, tell us about the red flags that you spotted, because you walked us through a very detailed summary of how Bill was drawn into this. And then once he started telling you about what happened, you were able to act and to be able to, I guess, counteract what the scammer was trying. So tell us what were the, you don't have to walk through every red flag, but just examples of red flags that you identified and can be helpful for us to know about.
The first red flag was when Bill said that he wasn't supposed to tell anyone,
Right.
or he wouldn't get his money back. My background at the Morning Call and also at Aging Technology, we do constant tests, if you will, on scams and phishing and anyone that might be searching for information. So that's one of the things that is highlighted for the training, that was highlighted in the training in both areas. The other thing was, if you knew Bill, he was so detailed. I mean, he would spend 4 days trying to find out where a penny belonged in the checkbook. So for him to make an error and add a 1 add a 1 in front of the 500 or an extra 0 at the end, that he would have never done that. That just wouldn't happen. So that was the second one. But the more Bill talked about the steps that went through, and when he told me that they had him install software and open a Venmo account, in order to open a Venmo account, they needed his driver's license and social security number. It had just gone further than needing to refund the $500. Not only that, if the charge was $499, why would you send us $500 back? Didn't make sense to me.
I think that we all learned from that story and your identification of those red flags. And so you had, I guess, your experience was both the area agents and aging of the aging office, but also working for a newspaper. I guess that helped as well. Huh?
Yes.
I wanted to move next to, and I'll turn to Ranking Member Braun, but because it is a busy Thursday, we'll have senators in and out, popping in, asking questions, coming to appear, but maybe not able to stay to ask questions. So we will maybe take some extra time at the beginning here. But I want to turn to Kathy Stokes and Scott Perillo. Ms. Stokes, you talked in your testimony about how society frequently places blame on the victims for falling for the scams, and that alone has to add considerable trauma to the experience. The stigma associated with being a scam victim discourages many older adults from reporting. I think that's probably an understatement, really low reporting levels, I guess. It's critical that this information is reported to the relevant agencies. I'd ask you this, why is it important for older adults to report frauds and scams that happen to them?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Reporting is critical. For one thing, it does help people who are in investigations see what's happening and tie cases together. But I think it's even more important because it will then help law enforcement and policymakers understand just how big this problem is. I had mentioned the FTC data that suggests that rather than a $9 billion amount of theft in 2022, I believe it was, they extrapolate on underreporting that it was $137 billion. If we're not reporting it, we can't do much about it.
And one of the best things we can do is just to continue to encourage people to report, huh?
Yes, absolutely.
And as well, Mr. Perillo, I wanted to ask you the same question. What can you add to this based upon your work through from the vantage point of law enforcement?
Thank you, Chairman. There is disorganization within reporting. Without a mechanism for centralized reporting, the policymakers are making uninformed decisions on where to allocate resources. There are a multitude of places that victims can go to report their crimes, and we know there's incredible data from the FBI and the FTC and a dozen other sources, including this own committee's fraud hotline number. The problem is there's no body that is consolidating all that data. There's no organization that is looking at the local police reports in each jurisdiction, and the huge void that we encountered and confronted in San Diego was the Adult Protective Services data from around the country represents a huge missing piece because they're getting unreported cases from mandated reporters. The financial institutions are referring cases to APS. And so when you combine all those numbers like we've done in San Diego, you get the number of actual reported fraud. The problem, as Kathy Stokes has mentioned, is you have to add a multiple to that. We know from all our work in the elder abuse community that we're only capturing 1 in 20 cases total. And so the FTC numbers were the first numbers to really provide that estimate.
That's helpful. And I know I went over because we're waiting for some folks, but I want to turn to Ranking Member Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start with Ms. Moore. Congratulations on what you've done back in Indiana, the acknowledgement that you're ferreting out fraud in our own state. That estimate of what it is, it was Senator Rick Scott and I and J.D. Vance that commissioned the GAO to find out what it is exactly. And I know that'll be helpful because we can see there's a wide range of what it might be. One thing that really caught me by surprise that there could have been one particular category, it was urinary catheters, that there was enough information that was pretty well, right under $3 billion. So in Indiana, did we get hit by that as well? And then tell me what you know about that particular fraud. Then what are the other top 2 or 3 frauds involving Medicare that you personally dealt with?
Thank you for your question, Senator Braun. The urinary catheter fraud is still being investigated, it's my understanding. But we've had about 40 cases reported to us. But again, if people don't, since you didn't receive any product, the only way you would know is to read your summary notices. And a lot of people don't read those, they're confused by those, or they just, if they don't owe any money, they're not prone to report it. So it kind of goes under the radar.
But did we have any that you actually caught in our state? In other words, it's clear that there would be a lot of unreported, because 2.7 billion would mean then that certain states are doing a pretty good job at it. And many other states aren't, because that is a huge figure. That's why I was curious in our own state, since it doesn't sound like there were that many, maybe just 40, did many actually lose money of those 40? Or did you just hear about it and then prevent it?
No, we reported it. Most of it was after Medicare had already been billed.
And the money had
Yes,
gone?
because it comes on your Medicare statements, which if you don't have a Medicare.gov account online, they're only mailed about once a quarter. So you wouldn't, like I said, nobody received the product
So
in
we
my
would-
own case.
So in Indiana,
Yes.
not
And they-
counting what wasn't maybe reported, but what was reported, we had kept that down to a fairly small amount, because that would be such a small fraction of 2.7 billion.
Correct, and some people were billed for as many as 12 months or 10 months, because in Medicare, you can bill, I think, up to a year, retroactively, so.
Believer that best practices among
Yes.
states ought to be shared.
Yes.
Sounds like you're doing a heck of a job. You've been acknowledged for it. It seemed to me, Mr. Chairman, that we would want to find out what other enterprising states are doing. That'd be one way to share stuff that's already working. So what are the 2 or 3 other scams in Indiana that seem to be most prevalent?
The most recent scams we're hearing about, and we're still getting, the DME braces scams and Medicare card, saying you need a new Medicare card. But one of the new recent ones is the caller, it's an imposter call saying they're from CVS, the large pharmacy chain, and that you can order your diabetic supplies through them. We've only had a few cases of that, but I've connected with my SMP colleagues throughout the country, and they're seeing this as well. CVS does have a disclaimer on their website that this fraud has been prevalent. And another one, which is very similar to the urinary catheter fraud, is people are being billed for ostomy supplies, which ostomy is any kind of artificial opening like colostomy or tracheostomy. And people are getting billed for that as well. And we are seeing that in many other states throughout the country. So I think one of our what has helped us is having investigative reporters do stories for us, because that really gets people's attention.
Well, good. Thank you for the good job you're doing back in Indiana. I would be interested to see how you keep track of it, and maybe over the last 3 years, what we've actually got on record in terms of true loss in our own state. And I'd like that idea of sharing what we're doing with maybe other states.
Definitely.
I'll yield back for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Brown. I'll turn next to Senator Scott.
Well, first, I want to thank the chair and ranking member for doing this. I mean, this is a significant issue that's impacting all of our states, and so I want to thank you for holding the hearing. I want to thank you for putting this book together, and hopefully it's going to help a lot of people not get scammed. First, Ms. Stokes, you mentioned in your testimony transnational criminal organizations are behind many of the modern scams. Are there any particularly favored countries these transnational criminal organizations use and hide in to evade U.S. prosecution?
Well, thank you for that question, and I think maybe Scott would be better able to, from a law enforcement perspective, speak to it. But what we know from our own experiences, big places are India, Africa, Costa Rica, Jamaica, Canada, and a lot of territories in Southeast Asia currently, including Myanmar, Cambodia, Philippines.
Scott, do you want to add anything?
Thank you, Senator. I echo what Kathy said. Yes, there's threats abroad. Right now, the most prevalent scam are tech scams that originate from Indian call centers. And the issue with enforcement is even if we had the capability to shut a call center down, they could obviously close up shop and move across the hall and start calling again, which is why the idea of a whole-of-nation strategy is really what would be impactful, because you have to look at the scam and then every point, either upstream or downstream of the scam, to see where we could stop it. And so if we could focus on how the Indian call centers, for example, are contacting our victims, that would be a way to significantly slow or stop the scam activity because they're using our own technology against us.
Do either of you have any sense whether the State Department's doing anything to prioritize this with regard, because take India, that's supposed to be an ally. Is the State Department doing anything to address this with the ambassador or anything?
I do know that the Department of Justice and the FBI has attachés in these countries, and they are working, and there are some successes to report on. Unfortunately, we're obviously have our finger in the dam.
Yeah. For any of you, with recent breaches in personal information, there could be an explosion of identity theft as millions of people's names, dates of birth, and Social Security numbers become available to criminal networks. How can we educate seniors to protect themselves and monitor their information for potential identity thefts that could result in loans or credit cards being taken out in their names? I don't know if any of you want to answer that.
Thank you, Senator. We at AARP tell people, your data are already out there. What we're seeing is just more and more of the same, and we all should be taking steps to sort of shut it down in the ways that we can. And one of the most important ways is to freeze your credit reports. That way, somebody who tries to use your identifying information to open credit against you is not able to do that by and large. Really, really important is how we deal with passwords. You know how difficult it is to have 12-digit passwords for your 50 online accounts. I find the password manager, once you kind of figure it out, is potentially a better way to deal with that, because if a criminal gets hold of a password that you use over and over, they're going to take over each account. Another thing is multi-factor authentication and shredding. I mean, it's online and it's in the real world too. So shredding your documents continues to be very important.
Scott, do you want to add something?
Thank you, Senator. I think a distinction does have to be drawn. Identity theft is a massive problem, and it is an incredible inconvenience for our victims. However, in a lot of cases, when there's a victim of identity theft, there are remedies through the banks, through financial companies that will recognize that someone's been the victim of an identity theft that they had nothing to do with. With elder scams specifically, our victims are really left with nothing. They go to their financial institutions and they're told that they're out of luck because they walked into the bank themselves and withdrew the money, and there's no remedy available to them at all. And really, when you understand the nuance of these scams and understand that the scammers in the most popular tech scam that I've described, the scammers actually tell our victims to keep their phone on and put it in their purse when they walk into the bank. They're being listened to by the scammers. And so there is a distinction, I think, between the identity theft and the elder scam victim.
Well, thank each of you for being here. And again, I want to thank the ranking member and the chair for putting this together.
Thank you, Senator Scott. We'll turn next to Senator Ricketts. If you're
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have other senators on their way, so as
Well, if they're not here, they don't get to go.
you jump right in. Jump right in.
All right, good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, as we know, many seniors and vulnerable Nebraskans are faced with challenges of protecting themselves and their loved ones from the threat of fraud, abuse, and financial exploitation. Financial losses due to scams continue to rise, particularly among older Americans. In 2022, consumers reportedly lost $9 billion to scams, a 30% increase over the year before. Older adults reportedly lost over $1.6 billion to scammers. The Federal Trade Commission has reported a tenfold increase in bank scams in the last 3 years. Scammers are also taking advantage of complex health care and insurance coverage decisions by impersonating the Medicare program. Late last year, officials with Nebraska groups that manage care for seniors began noticing a sharp increase in billings to Medicare for urinary catheters. Quarterly Medicare data for One Health in Nebraska indicated that spending on these devices on behalf of their patients was up an average of $60 a patient, totaling more than $1 million. The fallout from the scheme and the harm done is still unknown. Many people affected by the scheme may not even be aware that they have been scammed. Ms. Whitaker, we know that elderly population is disproportionately targeted by malicious scam calls. Do you believe an education and awareness of how these scams work could better prepare those being targeted? And how would you approach being able to make people aware?
Thank you. Absolutely, I believe that education is really important. And we at the Area of Aging, we've put together posters, flyers, pamphlets, magnets, and we have a folder that we actually take out to each individual that we're going to see. And this information is right inside the folder, including the magnet. Who to call in case you are a victim of fraud or you feel that there has been the scam taking place. It includes the fraud hotline, the Attorney General's number, the local police officer, state police, I believe is the phone number that's on there. And it walks you through the steps of exactly who to call and what to do.
And how do you distribute that? How do you get that information out?
We have an advisory council, and the advisory council members distribute some of that information for us. In addition, our assessors take a folder out of all of aging's information to every individual that they see. One of our assessors may, I believe the assessors see about 200 people a week, if not more. So we're getting that out to at least 200 people, 800, 1,000 people a month. And the assessors do walk through that information. If you are receiving waiver or option support, that is also covered by those that are going out, our aging care managers, and are seeing them.
So it's a very one-on-one.
Very one-on-one. We also did a scam seminar for the public and for healthcare workers at DeSales University. That was just this past year. I don't want to quote the month because I could be wrong, but we had a huge attendance. And I've learned that Scott's associate was the person doing was one of the presenters. We had representation from the local banks, the district attorney's office, some of our own detectives, aging. So we held that and made that available to anyone that was interested in attending.
Great, thank you. Ms. Moore, there's a long list of ways scammers can take advantage of seniors. Are there certain methods of scamming that are more prevalent in rural areas?
Oh, thank you. That's a good question. I think most scams start by telephone or text, whether they're rural or, urban beneficiaries. I do think the telephone, communications, we need more safeguards, and calls can be spoofed and labeled to look like they're coming from a legitimate organization or with their area code and even prefix. So people tell me they're more likely to pick up. We tell people not to answer unsolicited calls or calls they don't have in their phone, or, if they have a landline, sometimes you can put in certain numbers. But I would say the telephone is probably the worst offender.
And do you think for rural areas, are there different ways of outreach or education that we need to approach when we're thinking about how do we educate seniors in rural areas?
That's something we, as a program, we work on. I think print media is better in rural areas, and I do think we try to get to the very small towns and counties in our state through just presentations, through area agencies on aging, or we have some senior centers. I have one of our partners does she sets up a table for about S&P and other services that the AAA offers in a free laundromat day for seniors. So we need to think really outside the box, maybe even hair salons and that kind of thing, to get to people that maybe aren't on the internet, don't, maybe see the news and that kind of thing.
Yeah, And I appreciate that because I think you're exactly right. Thinking outside the box about how you reach seniors in rural areas is an important thing to do. And I would just emphasize what you said about print. You know, those weekly newspapers that are in rural Nebraska, and I'm sure in other parts of the country, they're read cover to cover, and they stay on the kitchen table or on the coffee table for a week. So if you have an ad or a story or anything like that in those, that's a great way to reach the seniors because they're read cover to cover and they leave them out for the week until the next edition comes out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ricketts, thanks very much. I'm going to do some questions now in a second round because I know we have at least two or three more senators that are kind of in transit. I wanted to direct these questions to Ms. Stokes and Mr. Perillo. As I mentioned earlier, that we've had for, I guess, a century prior to 2017, the casualty and theft loss deduction. The theft victims could claim a tax deduction to offset their loss when they're a victim of a scam or other theft. That changed in 2017 with the tax bill. So the theft loss deduction was changed. It was repealed. So now victims of fraud and scams can no longer deduct their losses. They owe huge tax bills on money they will never benefit from, leaving many older scam victims to feel that they have been victimized a second time. Earlier this year, as I mentioned in my opening, we released a report entitled Scammed, Then Taxed. And that legislation, or that report, outlined what had happened. Both of you work extensively with older adults, and you have tragically had those adults who have tragically had the entirety of their life savings stolen from them. So I'll start with Ms. Stokes. Have you encountered times when older adult scam victims were surprised that they owed taxes on their stolen money, and how does that affect them?
Thank you, Senator. The victims that we've talked to personally through our helpline and through these online victim support sessions that we have, this is probably the thing that makes them the most anxious. It's re-victimization, plain and simple. They've had everything stolen from them, but the IRS sees that as income, and they tax them on it, and they don't even have the money to pay that tax. So it is an issue of great anxiety for many people who are experiencing this.
And I guess part of the challenge here is that sometimes tax professionals may not have been they may not have updated their information about how the tax law changed, and may not be telling people enough. So we've got to make sure that people know, and I think the remedy here, of course, is to change the law back to the way it was and reinstate that deduction. Mr. Perillo, how about your experience with this?
Thank you, Chairman. I have talked to several victims who have encountered this, and this is a result of the scammers elevating their techniques by having our victims not just drain their checking or savings account, but actually completely liquidating their 401k or retirement account. We're talking about victims that have lost 7 figures, as you said, the entire nest egg. And the timing of it is that they go through the trauma of losing everything in their life, and they're just rebounding, maybe 6 months, a year later, and their accountant tells them that they have a 1099 from their brokerage company that says they owe, for one of my victims, a $300,000 tax bill. I equated that to a gut punch at the end of this. And there's another layer beyond that because many of these victims have no recourse, that they have to go online and find a tax attorney that they have to pay tens of thousands of dollars to. There is another void just on the IRS's website, has a lot of information about identity theft. There's no direction. Our elder scam victims are left bewildered. And if they go to the IRS site, there's nothing for them to click on that says, you've been scammed, here's some instructions to follow to get to this amazing program, the Taxpayer Advocate Service. Most victims have no idea what that is, and they're just spending money and being scammed on top of scams. So yes, that is a significant issue for those victims that have lost the most.
Yeah, I think what the phrase you use, gut punch, is a good way to describe it. It's, it's bad enough to be a victim of a scam. Then to get the gut punch of a tax bill where that was not happening before that change in 2017. I'll turn next to Ms. Whitaker again and Ms. Stokes. I said earlier that there's obviously an emotional impact that people experience, which is probably indescribable. And I'm going to be turning to Senator Kelly in a moment, but Ms. Stokes and Ms. Whitaker, you had made reference to your own experience, Ms. Whitaker, a personal experience, and Ms. Stokes through your work. I mentioned the emotional turmoil that people experience generally, but then when they're hit with a tax bill, it's far worse. One of the victims that we described talked about the scam as, quote, an excruciatingly painful experience, unquote. Another said, when I found out I was scammed, I had suicidal thoughts, unquote. So it's clear that these scams do far more than just take money from people. Ms. Whitaker, can you describe the feeling that you and your husband had when you knew that you were a victim of a scam? But I guess he was a victim and you were learning about
it. Devastation. Thank you. I was also angry. I have to admit that I was pretty upset with Bill, and he felt like he had really, really done something wrong when he was just really trying to save some money for the company. He didn't want to be charged something he didn't order. But then afterwards, it was just, we were devastated. It was the needing to pay back the money to the business, which he felt he was responsible for losing to begin with. And I understand that. It was the right thing to do. But it was just devastation.
it. Yeah, I can't even imagine it. And I'll keep saying it. It's these scam artists. They obviously target seniors disproportionately, but it can happen to anybody. I'll turn next to Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all of our witnesses for being here today to talk about a topic I think is sometimes uncomfortable talking about. Mr. Perello, I understand from your testimony that the Elder Justice Task Force you helped create in San Diego is the first of its kind, bringing together local law enforcement, FBI, Adult Protective Services, and the U.S. Department of Justice. I'm impressed by the task force's ability to collect real-time information and disrupt scams taking hold in your jurisdiction, especially ones that are originating overseas. I've gotten some scam calls myself from overseas before, and have been personally tempted to take them on by myself. However, I know it's best left to professionals like yourself for doing this, and you're proving that here. So, Mr. Perello, what's the key to the success of your Elder Justice Task Force?
Thank you, Senator. Well, San Diego does have a proud tradition of collaboration between local and federal authorities and amidst all the local authorities, and I think that is the largest piece. As we travel around the country and talk to people who want to duplicate what we're doing, you hear things like that people can't even get other colleagues from other agencies on a telephone call. So it requires people that view this issue with passion and are willing to sacrifice to get a task force like this up and running.
And how do we, so first of all, how much does it cost to operate your task force?
Well, it's interesting, Senator. Our task force started as a collateral responsibility for myself and every other member of law enforcement or the FBI, and so there really wasn't a cost. It was kind of a side hustle, so to speak, for many of us. So where the money needs to go is funding investigators, funding analysts. We need to fill positions. The law enforcement community is so starved for resources that it is very difficult to get any agency to dedicate a full body, a full resource to this. And sadly, as you go around the country, there probably is not one single person in law enforcement anywhere, locally or federally, that 100% of their job responsibility is focusing on elder scams.
So if it wasn't a collateral duty in your office and you were going to have dedicated people, how many people would be doing this?
Well, Senator, the numbers are staggering. As successful as we've been in San Diego, we are working less than 0.1% of the intake, to give you an idea of this tsunami of fraud that's coming at us. And so we'll take one body. We could use an army, obviously. And so it really takes, again, a group of people that's committed to this cause to start building it in each community. We started and we felt the best first step forward was identifying how big of a problem it was. It goes back to that underreporting and lack of centralized reporting mechanism. But as each jurisdiction, locally and then nationally, come up with the actual loss amounts in their own jurisdictions, that is the number that we need to go to the policymakers and decision makers to ask for the resources that this problem merits.
Yeah, so we can understand the amount of resources. I often think about this in terms of people. So if you were going to stand up for your office, a team of people that were 100% dedicated to this, to actually handle the demand that you see out there, the fraud that's out there, how many people are we talking about?
You could get a task force started with one local prosecutor like myself, one investigator from the DA's office or from a local police or sheriff jurisdiction, and then cooperation from the local FBI office. You could hit the ground running with the caveat that you need also the local U.S. Attorney's Office to devote resources. The number one obstacle that we faced when we started our task force was the dirty word called thresholds within the criminal justice system. To get federal agencies like the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office to open up a case, typically you needed $1 million cases. And so most of the cases, like unfortunately Ms. Whitaker's family, start by losing $25,000. Even $300,000, you can't get the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office to open up that case. And so our task force was devoted to working locally to connect the dots, to show our federal partners that these were $1 million cases once you connected the dots, but also for our local task force, the chains of command at the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office eliminated thresholds, which is a huge, the only thing that got us really off the ground so that we can all work collaboratively on these cases.
Take a couple more minutes. So another question on communications platforms, Mr. Perello. We had a hearing on this topic last November where we talked about how artificial intelligence plays a growing role in scams, both preventing them but also enabling them. And we talked about a constituent of mine who had received a phone call from somebody she thought was her daughter, and the daughter was screaming and crying, and a man came on the phone to say that he was going to do harm to her daughter if the woman didn't pay $50,000. Turned out that her daughter was, safe at home, and this was just an AI-created scam call using voice cloning technology. And we learned in that hearing how difficult it is to trace and prosecute a scam if no money has been exchanged, which was the case here. So, Mr. Perello, from the law enforcement perspective, why is that so challenging to trace and prosecute a scam if the scam wasn't completed?
Well, Senator, we believe that you have to devote your limited, scarce resources to where you can have the greatest impact. And so when we talk to a victim and learn that they almost fell for their scam, there's great relief. As I mentioned before, the intake is coming at us faster than we could process, and so every single day we have victims that are losing tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars, and our focus is in the first days after someone's been scammed is not necessarily putting a bad guy in jail. It's let's do everything we can to try to pull this money back from them. On the artificial intelligence piece, that is a great evidence that there's urgency here. We can't sit on the sideline any longer because with AI coming, the scammers are going to be doing even better than they're doing now, and they're doing really well without the use of artificial intelligence. When we look at the numbers, as Kathy mentioned, where the estimates of actual losses beyond what's reported is over $100 billion a year. And so if that's how much the scammers are getting from us without artificial intelligence, this is the time. The time is now. We're reaching a tipping point, and we couldn't be more grateful for this committee to take up this issue.
I read this article on CNN about a man in Virginia who was a victim of a pig butchering scam, and met somebody online, convinced him to invest in crypto. He did it, never met her in person. He lost his entire life savings, and then he took his own life. The person on the other side of the screen, wasn't just someone bored at home over the weekend. It was, probably over in Southeast Asia somewhere, a organized crime outfit that is doing this at scale, and it's very sophisticated, run by professional criminals. And they're getting older adults, as you mentioned, $100 billion. A lot of it is probably this, this confidence investment scam. So what do we do about it? How do we, they're not going to stop. What kind of negative incentives can we put to the countries involved? I know this isn't your area of expertise, but beyond just informing the public about this, I imagine for you it's hard to prosecute somebody that you don't know that's in a foreign country where we may or may not even have an extradition treaty. And it's hard to identify who these people are. But from a foreign policy standpoint, you have any ideas about what the federal government could be doing at the highest level to put pressure on the countries that are harboring these organized criminal groups?
Thank you, Senator. Sorry. Thank you, Senator. I'm proud there's leadership coming from California, from San Diego with our Elder Justice Task Force. The Santa Clara District Attorney's Office is actually a national leader in combating the pig butchering scams, and Deputy District Attorney colleague testified in Congress yesterday on this issue. I don't have an answer, a magic pill to solve that problem, but what I can say is when we're dealing with countries that are outside of the reach of United States law enforcement, I think the effort, and there are concrete steps that we could take, again, upstream of the scam to eliminate the ability for the scammers in Southeast Asia to contact our victims. That's where resources should be spent and pressure on the technology industry. Every one of our victims is being contacted on a spoofed telephone number or a foreign IP address over the devices and technology that we depend on every day. There are countries like the UK and Australia that have implemented programs specifically designed to eliminate that, and their trends are actually skewing downwards in the last 2 years. There's an addendum to my testimony that was submitted from the Stop Scams Alliance, who's led by a former CIA analyst, and there's some real concrete, specific things that the technology and communications companies can do. And so if we eliminate the ability for these call centers to reach our victims, then we don't have to worry about the expense of chasing them to Myanmar or wherever else they are.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Kelly. We obviously allowed extended time here. Senator Kelly, it was a very important set of questions. I think this can lead to some good bipartisan work, and I hope we can stay in touch on this. We'll turn next to Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing and for this booklet, which I think will be very useful to a lot of my constituents, including the one in Spanish. So I want to thank Senator Casey for putting together these materials. Very important to educate people. Half of our job on topics that involve scams is to educate and enlighten and warn people, including what law enforcement does, as I know from having acted against these kinds of scams and con artists as State Attorney General, as well as United States Attorney in Connecticut. Mr. Perello and Ms. Stokes, in your testimony, you both call attention to elder scams involving cryptocurrency ATMs. Along with Senator Durbin and a number of my colleagues, I wrote a letter to 10 of the largest Bitcoin ATM operators on their failures to prevent elder scams, despite reports that criminals are coercing elderly Americans to make large deposits into these Bitcoin ATMs. These companies have not taken any steps to ensure their ATMs are not being used in these scams. So I would like to ask you, what do you think Congress should do to address elder scams involving Bitcoin ATMs and cryptocurrencies?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I know that the cryptocurrency vector is very, very concerning. So much is being stolen by convincing somebody that something that isn't true, and getting them to go to their bank, take out tens of thousands of dollars in cash, then telling them where to go to find the crypto machine, and then them standing there and putting $100 at a time into these machines and coaching them on how to get that money to the electronic wallet of where they think that this is going to solve a problem, and it's just created all that much more. And I know that AARP's state affairs are out there trying to get changes in crypto regulation. We do definitely need more regulation there, and some of the things that they're looking at are, warnings about the fraud types that they're used in, transparency around the fees and the rates, and really importantly, I think, daily transaction limits.
Thank you. Mr. Perello?
Thank you, sir. Sorry. Thank you, Senator. We did have a recent victim in San Diego who fell victim for the scam, withdrew $15,000 from her bank and went into a liquor store in a part of town she shouldn't have been in the middle of the night to put $15,000 cash into one of these machines. And I echo the sentiment. We have to have transaction limits, but we clearly need to look at this industry as a whole and how it exists and what safeguards and accountability these companies should have. These companies are relying on the fact that our victims showed their driver's license to the machine. So they're complying with the know your customer requirements of their industry. However, clearly these victims do not know what they're caught up in. They don't know where their money's going. And in this investigation that I just mentioned, we learned that our victim in Escondido, California, put $15,000 into the machine. Within 12 minutes of her putting her cash in the machine, money was taken from that Bitcoin wallet and placed on an overseas Bitcoin exchange that's outside the reach of law enforcement in the United States. And so the window is so tight for there to be any intervention, and so there should be as many safeguards as possible to prevent these victims from putting their money in these machines in the first place.
And I take it from both of you that the companies themselves are doing virtually nothing to try to forestall these frauds.
Yes, Your Honor, or Your Honor, I'm a prosecutor, I'm sorry, Mr. Blumenthal. Thank you, Senator.
That's okay.
I mentioned earlier I was a career prosecutor. I can't turn that off. Thank you, Senator. The cryptocurrencies, some are being responsible in the sense that they're submitting suspicious activity reports like a bank would, but as I mentioned, it's well after the fact that the victim's money is unrecoverable. And so both within our jurisdiction and around the country, there's frustration growing within law enforcement. We have a victim that runs to the police station and says, I just put $10,000 into this machine and my money's sitting right there in that machine. Can you get it back for me? And so far, there is an inability to do that because of the nuance of how these cryptocurrency transactions work. And so even a period of time, just like when you go to wire money, that there's a hold for 48 hours, just a brief period of time before that transaction takes place would save millions. There's no question.
My time has expired, but I would welcome from you or any other members of the panel suggestions on how we can hold these companies accountable. The principle of accountability, I think, is very important. They know what's happening. They could stop it. We need to make sure they do take action to stop it. So I would welcome your additional written responses if you have any. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. We'll turn finally to Senator Warnock.
Thank you very much, Chair Casey, for your vigilance with protecting American consumers in so many ways, and thank you for your focus on this topic. According to the FBI's data on elder fraud complaints, Georgia has the unfortunate distinction of being in the top 15 states for the number of complaints filed, and we're in the top 10 for the amount lost, almost $92 million in 2023 alone. This data is stark and deeply concerning. But it's easy to get caught up in abstract numbers. Even a high number like $92 million, what does that actually mean for folks who are paying attention to this hearing? So let me highlight a story to remind us of what's at stake. Behind the numbers are real people. My office recently heard the story of a Georgia senior who was a victim of a financial scam in which the scammer impersonated an Army office, asking this Georgian for money to pay for his veterans' benefits. Thankfully, her son, who is also a veteran, was able to prevent his mother from sending the scammer money. But it was a close call, and there are too many cases where these scammers take advantage of seniors. I've seen it up close as a pastor with members of my own congregation. It can be difficult to talk about, but I believe the more we shed light on these deceptive practices, the more we can remove stigma and shame and encourage people to report when something isn't quite right. Ms. Whitaker, thank you so very much for being here. And could you talk about your own personal experience with scams and how it impacted you?
Okay, financially, first of all, I think that the scammers do some sort of research. I'm not sure what they use as their resource, but they clearly are doing research on their victims because they seem to know exactly what's available and what's not available and when to stop. Because this started on a Tuesday and Bill didn't say anything to me until Friday, little chunks of money seemed to be missing over the course of 4 days, which he was not aware of, and I wasn't aware of because he didn't say anything. It was, in the end, when we took a look at what was lost, and my father had just passed away, so we had some money from my dad. That unfortunately was gone, but it saved us from actually having even more of a loss than what we already had. But because there was nothing left in our savings account or our checking account, it affected decisions that had to be made as far as medicine that was needed to take. You know, he chose not to take certain medicines. Fortunately, in the future, I understand that some of those medicines will be taken care of, but he chose not to take Repatha, which had a huge out-of-pocket expense, but it was necessary for his cholesterol, but he wasn't going to take it. He chose to not take all of his insulin. He should have taken insulin twice a day, in the morning and at night. He chose to cut those back from the number of units that he was taking until we paid the business back. Once the business was paid back and he felt better about where we were, then he started doing some of the things he should have done, but not all of them. So it wasn't just a financial effect, but he sort of stopped living, if I can say it that way. He was so ashamed of what he had done that he just made himself not available to people. I'm not sure if I
So
answered
this,
your
this,
question.
no,
Thank you.
This scam had a material impact on your family,
It did, yes.
literally dragging the health of your father down as a result of it. And that's, without putting words in your mouth, it sounds like the
My husband, it was actually my husband,
sorry,
yes.
it then into depression.
Yes. Depression actually for both of us.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was,
Yeah.
until
But
you get and then you reach a point where you just say, okay, enough is enough. You got to get up, you got to move on. I was able to do that. He was not.
Well, thank you so very much. It takes a lot of courage to come to a place like this and tell your story. But I wanted folks to hear just a little bit of it because I think sometimes we get lost in the data and in the numbers. You're the human face of the issues that we must address. So I look forward to working with Chair Casey and the Committee to Protect Seniors and their families from the scourge of scams. Ms. Whitaker mentioned the ways in which our work separately on the issue of capping the cost of prescription drugs, my bill, which caps the cost of insulin, and other drugs, is helping seniors. So even as we protect them from the big pharmaceutical companies and their excesses, we also got to protect our seniors from these scams. Again, thank you so very much for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Warnock, and I appreciate you asking Susan Whitaker those questions. I'm going to close now. We're at the end of our hearing, and we also have a vote coming up. So we just want to thank our witnesses for their testimony, the expertise they bring to bear, their own personal stories, and the wisdom you provide to the committee to either change a law or remedy the policy that took away a deduction, but also to really begin to focus on what the federal government can do more of to combat this problem. As you heard, for the audience, I'd say, as you heard from our witnesses, scam losses are on the rise. Fighting frauds and scams that target older adults is going to take a multi-pronged whole-of-government approach, and that means every level of government. And I think the federal government can do more, as we heard today. As Mr. Perillo shared in his statement and in answers to questions, education and prosecution alone won't solve the problem, but we have to do both. We need to hold all those involved, whether it's a bank or a social media company or any other perpetrator, accountable and ensure our law enforcement agencies have the resources they need to address this issue head on. And I think there's should be some good bipartisan work ahead of us on that. We also need to reduce the stigma associated with these crimes. If you've been scammed, you're not alone. You're a victim of a crime and you should not blame yourself. If you've been victimized, please report this to our federal agencies without shame. Without knowing the true scope of this issue, Congress can't provide federal agencies with the resources needed to catch these criminals. We'd urge people to report the scam as soon as possible to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, also known as IC3. That's capital letter I, capital C, and the number 3. At ic3.gov, or to the Federal Trade Commission at reportfraud.ftc.gov. So we'll continue to amplify those resources for folks to turn to. We also need to support our older adults who've been scammed with regard to the financial and emotional impact that we know is profound, and the federal government should work to lessen that blow. Ms. Whitaker's testimony that she just made reference to a few moments ago about her husband, quote, stopped living, in a sense, says it all. So this means that we've got to work together to make sure that older adults who've been scammed out of their life savings aren't on the hook for the taxes for withdrawals associated with the scam. I also will move to submit for the record the report that I made reference to earlier, Scammed Then Taxed, which is a report about the change in the law that took away that deduction. And I'll also submit for the record a letter from AARP about the repeal of the theft loss provision. So both the letter and the Scam Then Taxed report will be made part of the record, so ordered. For those watching today, I want to emphasize that the committee is here as a resource, whether you just want to learn more about this problem, or in fact, if you've been targeted by a scammer. You can access our resources, including the committee's newest fraud book with information, tips, and resources, and a helpful bookmark with quick tips via the Aging Committee's website at aging.senate.gov/scam. And I'll recite that again, aging.senate.gov/scam. Ranking Member Braun will submit a statement for the record, and that statement will be added to the record, so ordered when we have that statement. I want to thank all of our witnesses once again for contributing their time and their expertise. If any senators have additional questions for the witnesses or statements to be added to the record, the hearing record will be kept open until Thursday, September 26th, 1 week from today. Thank you all for participating. This concludes our hearing.